Something I find interesting about screenwriting is the ability to shape an audience experience vicariously via the experience of a movie's characters or plot. It's interesting to me how we identify with characters, how we love and hate them based on how they act and behave, how we cheer characters who reflect who we are or who we would like to be. Even more interesting is how sometimes we identify, cheer and respect characters who are not good, who don't reflect who we are or who we want to be. How can we champion a character from a movie who acts in deplorable ways, who has malicious intent, who lacks basic human qualities like empathy, sympathy and patience? This is very interesting to me. Falling Down is a 90s movie about an abusive and violent ex-husband who is recently let go from his job working as a defense contractor for the government, and suffers a series of patience-testing frustrations which ultimately lead to him engaging in the violent and impulsive behaviour, which saw him separated from his wife and child. He's unbalanced, violent, and unpredictable. Yet somehow, I connect with this guy. I think the popularity of this movie rests entirely on the audience identifying with a violent, impulsive man with no conscience. And it works. How did this happen? Are we all psychopaths? If we break a human being down into the most basic of components, we can be broken down into a collection of the following: thoughts, feelings, and actions. It's in this regard that we can understand why Defense is so relatable. Oftentimes his thoughts and feelings about the events in his life are entirely relatable issues. We can all relate to being laid off, or separated from the things we love, or a traffic jam. The first characteristic which helps us to connect with Defense, I'm not making this up by the way, his name is listed in the credits as Defense. The first characteristic is reason, which might seem like a strange thing to say that a murdering psychopath exhibits, but he does. For Defense, his ability to reason is tied to his level of patience. It's short, but it's there. Each time a frustrating incident happens, it's always preceded by him attempting to be reasonable, even if it's his somewhat selfish attempt at being reasonable. When he enters the convenience store, he's simply looking for change to use the phone outside. He steps in like any other customer and asks for change. When the shopkeeper says no, he decides to buy something. When the shopkeeper gives him a price that he feels is too high, he attempts to barter and lower the price so that he still has change for the phone. Even after the shopkeeper refuses, he doesn't immediately become aggressive. He attempts to equate their situation with the fact that the US gives money to the Korean government, and hence the Korean shopkeeper should help him out. When he's accosted while taking a rest on what appears to be an occupied piece of land, he again attempts to reason his way out first, even apologizing for being on their gangland. He tries to understand the perspective, and despite being a little sarcastic and dismissive, he does attempt to defuse the situation without violence. This is a pattern which is repeated at each hostile event. In Whammy Burger, he politely asks for breakfast and is told no. He reasons that he's just a customer looking for breakfast when it's only a few minutes past breakfast serving time. Even during the calls with his estranged wife, his request is reasonable. All he wants is to see his daughter on her birthday. The homeless guy in the park is another example. When he asks for money, Defense initially doesn't say no. He just wants evidence that what he's being told is the truth, until eventually the lies have all been unraveled by simple questions and Defense says no. Unlike other violent sociopathic characters, Defense never demonstrates that he's an unreasonable person. Quite the opposite. His requests are often well within reason, even if they're a little misguided. And they're also often daily annoyances that you or I have experienced in our lifetime. Despite being faced with constant frustration and danger, Defense is never rude or impolite. He makes a point of maintaining manners at all times, best demonstrated in Whammy Burger, when he points out that using first names when he doesn't know them can be considered impolite.
Why am I calling you by your first names? I don't even know who you are. I still call my boss Mister. I worked for him for 7.5 years, but I walk in here all of a sudden total strange, and I'm calling you Rick and Sheila like we're in some kind of AA meeting.
An interesting and pretty funny character quirk is that after the server jokingly says that he can refer to her as Miss Fulton, he does so for the remainder of the scene because in his mind, he's simply being polite and using the name that she requested be used. With each incident, he gives polite requests, maintains a balanced and open dialogue with his opposite. He doesn't interrupt, he doesn't speak over people, and he always gives people the opportunity to reply whilst also listening. Not typically things which a villain would do. In the surplus store, Defense seems visibly annoyed at the way the Nazi store owner first speaks to the gay couple and then later with the female police officer. Again, this is likely because he would feel it impolite to treat people with such disdain when there's no just cause to do so. Perhaps the most defining character trait of Defense is that he considers himself a man of principle. This is why he is polite and reasonable. Although other people who know him think of him as a distant and violent person always on the edge of snapping, he's never really shown to be this way. It's true, he is short-tempered and ready to resort to violence, but it's never unprovoked. During the convenience store attack, he does ransack the store, but only because he thinks the prices are extortionate, even going as far as to say,
Just standing up for my rights as a consumer.
He believes he's correcting a moral wrong, a wrong which is relatable to all of us, ridiculously high prices. When the frightened store owner shouts to take his money, Defense seems appalled by the suggestion because he was never there to steal and he has no intention of doing so now. When he finally leaves the store, he does so only after paying for the drink which he was forced into buying because the store owner wouldn't give him change. And he does so with the same polite demeanour with which he began the exchange in the first place. He had the opportunity to take what he wanted from a person who he felt was being unreasonable, but instead, he chose to pay for the item that he was forced to buy and then leave. The same thing happens again in Whammy Burger. Despite holding a bag full of guns and a submachine gun in his hand, he never robs the Whammy Burger. He orders a meal, pays for the meal, and attempts to eat the meal. He only really becomes aggressive when he feels that his rights as a consumer have been trampled on. Even after being served his order, his complaint is that he's not been given what was advertised. He's a consumer rights activist, not a thief or a robber. With the gang members on the hill, despite being a bit dismissive and sarcastic, he actually sees himself as in the wrong and attempts to exit the situation without confrontation. He could have stood up to them and asserted his dominance, but instead, he sees their perspective and realizes that he's on their turf, and therefore he's in the wrong. It's only after they become unreasonable that he assaults them. In the Nazi store, there's a long period when Defense doesn't say much, because he seems to be trying to work out what his place in the situation is. His principles push him in the direction of not judging the man because of how he's helped Defense, at the same time as propelling him into the opposite direction due to his treatment of other people. Eventually, when the store owner shows just how fascistic he really is, and tries to explain that he and Defense are similar, his principles kick in, and he rejects the store owner, which eventually leads to another violent confrontation. Ultimately, the reason that Defense sees himself as a principled and functional member of society is because we're all heroes in our own story. It's easy to identify with him in this regard because each adversity he faces is against a perceived slight, beginning with the trivial and ending with the genuinely terrifying. In the beginning, I said that humans can be broken down into thoughts, feelings, and actions, with each feeding into one another. In the case of Defense, we connect with his feelings, we agree with his thoughts, which helps us to sympathize and empathize with his actions. Defense doesn't see his actions as being wrong because he finds moral justification for each instance. And it's actually pretty hard to argue against because each time he tries to behave like an ordinary member of society, and each time he's given a push into a darker direction. He doesn't view himself as the villain, which is obvious from how even though his actions become more and more extreme, he becomes more and more oblivious to his failings. He genuinely sees himself as a consumer rights activist, a hard-working, law-abiding member of civilized society, a guardian of the classic American way of life.
Are you fucking with me?
I am
just
fucking
disagreeing with you! In America, we have the freedom of speech!
The opening scene of Falling Down details everything we need to know about defense and what we can expect. He's a person trapped in a static, stifling situation who repeatedly attempts to negotiate and reason himself into a better one, but who is deprived of options and ultimately forced to step out of the normal flow of life to pursue his very simple goal.
Going home. Hey!
His final scene is symbolic of his character and also a big reason why he's so relatable, why we connect with him despite his increasingly violent methods. He threatens a showdown with the police officer. He reaches for his gun and takes a gunshot to the body, only to reveal his gun was a water pistol all along. Even his final actions are kind of a heroic sacrifice. Once he realized that he was the
The
villain,
bad guy?
that he had not been the person that he thought he was.
How did that happen? I did everything they told me to.
He sacrifices himself so that his daughter can collect the insurance money from his death. He represents how many of us come to feel later in life. Honest, hard-working people who are essentially just forgotten cogs in a much bigger machine. Cogs which have slowly been ground down over time until our teeth have been worn to a flat surface, and we no longer have a place in the machine we served so well.